took one piece of the Agoric Systems ideas and nailed it. Who remembers Freenet? Who has used Freenet? Trepidation. Freenet pioneered a lot of the ideas of a proper uncensorable web. So thank you. Who has used Kademlia? Who has implemented Kademlia? A couple people? Try it. It's not that hard. It's great. And by the way, look at these rock stars. Of course, they, Mazieres with a bass and that are doing yoga. So whoa, I'm gonna break this thing. DHTs and self-organizing scalable routing. They weren't the only DHT. There were a bunch of other DHTs, but they're the most notable because it's the most used. Even though we probably have come up with way better DHTs than Kademlia by now. Who remembers Skype and their peer-to-peer stuff? Who laments that it's no longer peer-to-peer? So it was the first example of getting to, I think, billions? I don't know if billions, but certainly many millions of users on peer-to-peer VoIP, which is amazing. Higher scale than any other system of those. Who remembers Tahoe? Who has used Tahoe? Yeah, thank you, Tahoe. Tahoe pioneered a ton of the things that we use today and used a lot of the capabilities work of Mark and other people and implemented in some of the first real systems that deployed the stuff at scale in a file system. So thank you. Who remembers Bitcoin? Who has sent some Bitcoin? Great. Who's received some Bitcoin? Yeah, right. Thank you for the blockchain, and thank you for cryptocurrency, and for global warming, too. Because this is now wasting as much electricity as Australia, apparently. I looked it up today. So let's fix that. Who remembers Spear CDN? Yeah, they did a really cool hack where they put JavaScript on a page, and as the page started loading, reloaded all the resources in a peer-to-peer way. It's a pretty sweet hack, ahead of its time. And those two guys that were here yesterday, they might be here today as well. In-browser peer-to-peer distribution of static assets. Who knows Matthias? Yeah. Who has used a module written by Matthias? Yeah. Thank you, Matthias, for writing great modules. Hackable BitTorrent video clients. Faraz then went on to build WebTorrent. Who has used WebTorrent? Great. You've probably used the WebTorrent on the archive because it's running a whole bunch of the video stuff there. And BitTorrent in the browser, it's pretty amazing. Who has used IPFS? Yeah, great. Thank you, Y, over there. That's why are you sleeping? And there's a lot of other people. So again, tons of other people not reflected here. This is kind of like the instigators of a thing. Who has used Ethereum? Yeah. Thank you to these three guys and a whole bunch of other people for making it. Who remembers? Who has used Secure Scuttlebutt? Yeah. Pretty cool idea for broadcasting messages, so the social network-based replication. Who has used that? Yeah, great. Thank you to these three and many other people for writing really good modules. So let's go to who has used Matrix? Yeah. It's trying to bring back XMPP and IRC into the world, trying to merge everything back. So if you care about messaging, help them out. Who's used OpenBazaar, or who has heard about it? Yeah, great. What I find amazingly impressive about this project is that they built, I think, the first really high-end consumer-facing application on the DWeb. It's the nicest. And so really go check it out. It's pretty impressive what they've managed to achieve with, the primitives that we have right now are not great. We need to get a lot of stuff better. So pretty awesome stuff. So who has used Patchwork? Yeah. I don't know if, I'm forgetting the first name of the creator. Does anyone know? No? He might be here. I don't know. So if you find him, then tell him to correct me. So decentralized social messaging. This was probably the first decentralized social messaging thing in the new decentralized web space. Who's used PeerGhost or has heard about it? Yeah, creators back there. Thank you. And thank you also for writing a bunch of modules that can be reused in other systems. Who's used ZeroNet? Yeah, great. Tomas is around here, so go meet him. A lot of really cool hacks. Who remembers MediaChain? Yeah, Arkady is around, like organizing this conference. MediaChain was a project in the last few years that tried a whole bunch of stuff and ran against really hard problems, and all of those people are around and making really cool stuff, so get to know them. Who has used Blockstack or knows about Blockstack? Yeah, great. Who has attended a rebooting Web of Trust thing? Yeah. Who agrees this is extremely useful? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the hard spec work. It is very necessary. Who has used JS IPFS to add some data on the browser? Yeah. Probably a lot of the crowd back there. So I'm now leading up to the DWeb Summit last year. This was a hack mostly for Brewster so that we could demonstrate fully decentralized peer-to-peer apps on just JavaScript. No installation necessary of anything. This was running just on JavaScript. It booted an IPFS node inside and allowed you to chat with other people. This was our first application that did that. I want to pause for a moment and thank the massive community that is making all of this stuff possible. This is just a small fraction of the people that have contributed code or issues or thoughts to the IPFS project or libp2p. So this is like generated from our set. This would be much bigger if we showed everybody, and it would be massive if we showed everybody contributing to all of the projects together. So that's like an interesting art project that maybe somebody should think about doing. There's a lot of other people that I would love to call out. I could have many slides like this with thanks. And I want to show the DWeb Summit for a moment. I want to bring us back to 2 years ago, DWeb Summit 1. This was a very important event because it built a community. The community that is now here grew from this. All of the amazing stuff that you see now was empowered and put on throttle thanks to that event. And I am certain, after seeing the conversations yesterday and today, that this is going to happen again. And the next event will probably be much larger, probably going to have to split into multiple events. We'll see what happens. So community building is a huge, important thing. And I want to, who wasn't here for that event? Great, this is awesome, because I'm going to show you some pictures, because they're great. And this is why pictures matter, because you can bring other people with you. So this is one picture that was taken. This 3 giants, 3 of our heroes. Thank you to them. This is random conversations around the archive. This is random conversations in the archive as well, but inside. These are panels and talks. A lot kind of like today, but there were single tracks. Panel of rock stars over there. You can tell by how they're dressed. I do very weird hand gestures. I probably did them again today, and I tried not to. And Vincerf is very skeptical of that. But it's okay, because Tim does it too. And Vincerf is very skeptical of all our nonsense. The archive pictures are amazing. This is all in the archive. But it's okay, because Wendy and Mitchell and Carissa also do it. And Brewster does it. And guess what? Vincerf does it a little bit. So so that event happened, and it was a very important moment because a lot of people got to chat and hack and brew ideas, and a lot of things spawned from that moment. Beaker is one of them, I think. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I think Beaker was talked about and discussed there, and it came out of that event. So we got a peer-to-peer browser. That's amazing. Thank you. We were already working on this stuff, but that really gave us a push to really split off all of the networking stack from IPFS and pull it out. And so now a bunch of people can use our stuff. So that gave us the motivation to split this out for other people. So thank you for the people that did most of the work, not me. Thank you, guys. And thank you to Gozala and a bunch of Mozilla people who are pushing really hard on making the DWeb a reality in stock browsers. This is awesome work that is going to enable all of our applications, so really thank you. And if you haven't checked this out, highly encourage you to go check out the project and help out. So handlers and networking in Firefox and so on. And by the way, this is pretty important because it's going to help motivate other browsers to do it too. So it is, thank you, really. It's going to help us all in a huge way. It is very, very important. I want to mention also the work. In the last year or two, there was some trouble in the government, and then a lot of important data sets got defunded very quickly. And scientists panicked because their data was going to go missing. And so a lot of them banded together into groups to rescue that data. And it was an amazing effort that popped up really quickly. A bunch of organizations were formed, Edgy, Data Refuge, and a number of others. And they just had hackathons where they would get together and train people on like archival ops and just downloaded data sets as fast as they could to then archive them somewhere. It's an amazing effort. So really thank you to, this is just a fraction of the people that were involved in this stuff, so really thank you to all of these scientists that preserved really valuable data. Our project learned to deal with multiple different computers and making them appear as a single IPFS node to support those data set use cases. So thank you to the people making this. It is a very useful way to manage very large volumes of data. Thank you. Curious if anyone's using Cluster at the moment. Like one, two people, great. Feedback. Who has tried out Janus VR? Yeah. Did you know that you can look at DWeb stuff in Janus VR? Pretty awesome. And there's an installation downstairs, so you can go check it out after the talk. And Decentralized, which I don't know if you've heard about, is a whole 3D VR world, and they're building, I think, one of the first clients into it. So that's going to be pretty cool in the coming years. A bunch of people out of the DWeb Summit got together and pushed on making an interrupt between all of the hash chains. And this is a project called IPLD. And that is trying to bring unity to the diverging webs that we have. So it'd be great to have one web, not multiple webs. Let's have one web. So this is what it is about. Thank you to the people bike shedding the spec, because that was a very long set of conversations. Thank you. OpenBazaar shipped their second version, and guess what? On mobile. Again, they're spearheading, and they built a whole DWeb app on mobile now. So if you want to do that, go check out how they did it. So it's pretty impressive. So go see that. And I'll tell you about another one in a moment. So decentralized marketplace in mobile. Who's seen a video on DTube? Yeah. When I saw this and loading so smoothly, I was like, wow, okay, great. This could actually work. Because they just got the experience so right. So this is very important. Projects who are trying to do consumer stuff, look at this stuff. Look at D2. They're doing it really well. I want to thank Ollie and Lidl. Ollie's not here, but Lidl is there, for making IPFS vastly more usable. This is Companion, which is a little web extension that you add to your browser, and then suddenly make sure that all links resolve through a local node. So that's pretty awesome. Thank you, personally. How many people have tried Companion? A few. The rest of you, try it out today. Who has seen Parati? I don't know if it's released yet, actually. Am I leaking things? Maybe? No, you have it on the website, so that's your fault. Anyway, Parati is another video platform that is coming soon. And I think they're already giving talks about it, so it's a pretty amazing experience. So again, another consumer-facing thing that has nailed the experience and is making it work. It's extremely difficult. I don't know if you understand how difficult it is to write good UIs and UX, extremely time-intensive in the normal world. If you move into the DWeb world, it is like 5 times worse. So that is a great area of work. So for all of us, a very hard open problem is make UI and UX way easier. And it requires some more infrastructure and some libraries. But thanks to these groups that are blazing, trailblazing to help others. So this is a really cool hack that shows CRDTs working, and the data is encrypted. And so you have an Etherpad that is encrypted and moving the content between peers without touching backbone servers. It needs some sort of signaling to find each other because browser tabs don't yet have access to the transports. We don't yet have libdweb everywhere. So it needs some signaling, but other than that, all of the content is peer-to-peer, which means this is an example of real-time collaborative applications as you're used to in Web 2.0 world in the DWeb. So thank you to the people that built it. Who has seen Polkadot? Who's excited about Polkadot? Yeah, there we go. They're bringing Unity to the chain world. They're bringing this interop between all of the different blockchains. And they have, they just shipped libp2p in their thing, so now they can have parity in the browser, which is amazing. I think it's the first blockchain that's going to be native on the browser like from day one. So pretty amazing. If you haven't seen the installation from Textile downstairs, go check it out later on, because this is another app. I couldn't find a picture of the interface on the web, but this is another consumer app where they've nailed the UX. So go check it out. It's pretty awesome. It's in a thing downstairs. And I wanted to also highlight LibreMesh. So this is a project that is building a whole bunch of routers, really low-cost routers for a bunch of underserved communities. And they may or may not connect to the internet, but the important thing is to get network connectivity there. And this highlights a big thing that the web of today does not do, but the DWeb can do very well, and that's offline. Async connectivity is way, way easier for the DWeb than the normal Web 2.0 world. So this is an amazing thing to do for the world and an advantage against the centralized world. So build applications for the people that use these kinds of routers and these kinds of networks. So if you're building an app, think about those use cases. There's like this really cool hack, more than a hack, it's like a service that you can turn on now. I think it's shipped. You can now have a service worker IPFS gateway on your browser. So this is without installing an extension, you go to a web page, you click one button, and then you have an IPFS node in your browser, I guess forever? You have to like go back to turn it off again, but then it will take all of the links going to the specific URL and reroute them through this, and then it'll serve your local node. And that node is a JS IPFS node. So thank you to the people that shipped that like in the last day, I think. And last but not least, I want to thank these guys, because it is important to be interesting to a mainstream subculture, right? Like if you can't get a mainstream subculture to care about your thing, it's going to be bad. And I think that they've given a great reference point for a lot of people on the planet to be like, oh yeah, like the Silicon Valley show? Yes, but it like works, and check it out. So I think it's a super useful thing, and also sometimes kind of scary to too close to home kind of thing. Talk to them about that. Who did I miss? I mean, I missed a ton of people, right? Like this is only a fraction of the DWeb projects. But do we want? I have 2 minutes to highlight a few more people. Who's in your mind that should be highlighted? That you are personally thankful for? Who do you want to give thanks to? Awesome. And what's interesting about it so that other people can hear? No global warming. Very cool. Go check that out. Thank you. Mark. Yeah, and just scratching the surface. I think many years to come can be filled with what Nick wrote about. So definitely go read that work. Anyone else? One more? No one has anyone to thank? Yeah, say it. Say it again. Yeah, so we want to thank Brewster and the archive. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much for hosting us. Thank you very much for building this community and for making this knowledge sharing possible. Okay, so that was the exciting and uplifting part of the talk. Now we're gonna get into the gory details. I picked a small subset of problems. These are not all of the problems that we need to solve, but it is a small and important subset, and is, I think, the subset that we need to focus on for the next year or 2 years. Achieving these things is make or break, and if we don't do it, these things are not going to be used by most of the people. First one, decentralization is not a good selling point. You can't just say, this app is decentralized, therefore it's better, and you should use it. That is not going to work with most of the people on the planet. If you wanted to sell an electric car, would you sell it by saying, hey, buy this car, it's electric? Or would you make a really great car that's better than all the other cars around and sell that? So I think this community as a whole, whenever you put decentralized somewhere, be aware that right now it's kind of a new word, so people are used to it. Pretty soon it's going to get old, and people are just going to be testing these apps for what they do. So make your products great and make them better than the alternatives. Find the advantages. Find the things that your thing can do that centralized things can't, and then you'll find a niche of users that will then love your thing and will give you the uplift that you need and the user base to then grow that into feature parity and augmentation beyond. But if we get stuck in the world of, hey, this is like trying to reach parity with the other thing and it's not quite there, but hey, it's decentralized, it's not going to work. Only a few people will use it, and it won't really have the transformative change that we expect. Scalability. So I argue that we are right here. Does anyone have a DWeb system built in the last 2-3 years that scales beyond millions? Nope, because our stuff is not there yet. We have good paths. All of it is scalable. We can get there, but it requires hard work. So I encourage all of us to take a very serious look at scalability for the next year. It would be great if when we meet again, we all are one notch deeper. If we can get one order of magnitude in the next year, I think it'll be great, and then it'll set us up for the billions as well. That is going to be way harder, but getting to millions, we should absolutely do it. It's not that hard. It just requires focus on performance and focus on like the really quirky, nasty bugs that appear when things get kind of big. So let's knowledge share around this and figure out how to solve these problems. So GitHub and all that kind of stuff work on these problems. Performance. So these apps need to be blazing fast. People don't like using stuff that's slow. We need to make these applications really good and really nice to use. So all the UX stuff applies, but in particular speed. We have a massive unfair advantage. Because of hash linking or key linking, we can load content and keep it there and not have to do additional round trips. So technically, we should be winning on the speed game. But we are a lot of optimizations away from that. But we could do that. We could use that as a very strong angle to beat the centralized groups. Good naming. Good naming is hard, really hard. There are good systems designs, but we haven't really deployed something that scales to billions that does what we want with naming, that allows really fast changing of names and has the versatility of being able to work in the different contexts of, I want this name to be permanent forever, and it's fine if it's expensive to change the pointer, to, I want to change the name constantly, like multiple times a second or multiple times a millisecond. So getting to a name system that is that good is hard. It'll require all of us or some subset of us coming together to do that. Security. So What is very worrying to me is that we're building all of this DWeb stuff that is using crypto, and it's supposed to be better and safer for everybody. And from my perspective, our security, our OPSEC and our security is like orders of magnitude worse than the centralized players. Orders of magnitude worse, meaning people at Google and Facebook and all these other places take very good care of all of the code bases that they ship and give to users at a degree that we just don't have the resources for yet. Or we haven't chosen to focus on this. So I think it is extremely important that as a whole community, while it's still small and it's not under the attention of any bad groups or state actors or anything like that, we get this right. The alternative is people getting hurt, seriously. People could be using your stuff in a dissident place, and people could be using your stuff in a place where they are considered dissidents, and if they get spotted, then it could be really bad for them. So if you're building this stuff, do it right and get audits, and try to build a process by which you ensure that your stuff is good, and clearly label stuff. If it's not there yet, clearly label it so that users don't accidentally use it thinking that it's completely safe when it's not. And this is something that we have to work on a lot in a lot of our projects. We need to upgrade our messaging on this. We have to upgrade our audit game. And we want the entire community to do this as well. So if you're interested in learning about how to do this and what we're going to be doing and so on, reach out. We are very happy to work with other people on this, because this is critical to the entire effort and critical for our users. We do not want them ever getting in trouble. Platforms. So far, we've only talked about the DWeb as it pertains to the browser, for the most part. There's a few pockets, a few projects here and there that talk about LibreMesh and so on, that talk about different things. But the vast majority of computers in the world are going to be not browsers. They're going to be mobile, IoT, and so on. So those platforms right now are on track to being locked. And so everything we make, all of the applications and all the platforms and all the tools and so on, need to work in those things. And so take a stronger look at the things you're building and make sure that you at least have a path, a viable path to get there. Because otherwise it'll just be a small fraction, a dwindling fraction of the users in the world. Especially, most people in the emerging networks don't have good access to browsers because they can't deal with this round-trip nonsense. And so, or they can't buy a large laptop. They have phones. And right now, most of the DWeb stuff doesn't quite work there. This might mean better mobile browsers, like a P2P browser for mobile. That would be amazing to see happen out of this event. If we come back next year and somebody has a P2P browser for mobile that does the right thing, it'd be amazing. What's up? There is already one. That's amazing. That's great. What is his name? That's great. Let 1,000 experiments bloom, because we're going to need a lot of effort here. So just because somebody else is doing it, don't not do it. So do it. And I guess I'm really concerned about mobile. The other stuff is easier. Toolchains and OSs are a lot easier. IoT is a mess. It's a real disaster. We could bring some solace to this world by adding a lot of good crypto. But I think we need to get mobile right first before we, by all means, go that route. But I think mobile is more important for the users. And the frontier, the amazing frontier of interfaces, VR, AR, maybe BMI, and all that kind of stuff. That's more further out. If you haven't gone to the installation downstairs, please go. Get used to VR. These things are going to come. They're always kind of coming soon, but the hardware is there now. What's missing is the software. So the software could come in 2 years, could come in 10 years. We'll see. But if we're not ready for it, then that platform is going to get completely owned by the data monopolies. And guess what? Facebook's already on it, right? So lots of groups want to completely take over that space and own people's experiences there. And so that's a platform that really needs a DWeb. But we got to solve a lot of problems before we can do that well. So let's target that, I think, towards maybe not next year, but the year after that. Or please do solve it now if you can. That'd be amazing. I want to talk about convergence a little bit. There is a very big problem in the world right now that is caused by the internet. So the internet, in its great ability to give everybody a voice and allow everybody to select the channels that they look at, we now have a massive fragmentation of groups where humans are now encountering hundreds or thousands of other humans that believe the same things they believe. And when you meet 1,000 other people that believe the same thing you believe, it confirms, it reaffirms it in such a way that it's very difficult to knock you out of that. So what we have going on right now is the world's best divergence machine operating at full speed globally, and now a bunch of state actors realize that, and they're manipulating it. And so we've seen this with recent elections, we've seen this with Cambridge Analytica, we've seen this in a number of cases. This is a massive problem. And guess what? We're about to make it worse. All of our tech is going to make this divergence worse because it's going to allow people not just to be separated in the same platform, visibly, it's going to cause people to diverge into platforms they can't even see. You won't even be able to see the divergence anymore. Right now you can see it. You can go and look at Twitter feeds from other groups and see kind of put yourself into that bubble. We're headed to bubbles that are opaque. And that is much more concerning. So we need to figure this out. There has to be some way in our systems to deal with this problem. So I urge you and I ask you to please think about this, because I don't know how to solve that. And I don't think, Mark, do you know how to solve it?
A big ask, but there's an observation that I've been making for a while that comes often as a surprise, which is prediction markets are an anti-polarizing social phenomena, or have the potential to be. Prediction markets don't really exist in a big way in the world right now, but the important social fact about prediction markets is the opportunity is people you disagree with.
Thank you. Moderation is also a big one, and it's similar. How do you do moderation correctly? Moderation right away leads to censorship. So how do you build systems where communities can moderate themselves and fork if they don't want to be subject to that moderation? I think this is easier than the convergence problem, but it's still not solved. Or at least it's not solved in the systems that we use. I think this is a lot easier, but I would love to see that in the applications that we use because it's not quite there yet. We tend to think about things in terms of an upgrade path. We think of all these kinds of platforms. We are happy that the PC and the web are open. Mobile is sort of in the middle, kind of locked in terms of what you can install, but at least you have the web. IoT is totally closed. This is going to, if we don't do something, it's going to be a disaster. And let's not even talk about that. Don't know how to handle that yet. And so I encourage you to think about this in terms of the things you build. Make sure that what you're building is runnable on those platforms and you have some path, some trajectory for that. Thankfully, JavaScript is going to run everywhere, and WebAssembly is going to run everywhere. So that's good, but make sure that your application doesn't depend too much on the interfaces. I'll just walk through this pretty fast. I'll just let it stand for itself. It's good enough. You get the gist. There's some upgrade path for the browser, almost there. There's some upgrade path for OSs. We haven't given that much attention, but we're almost there. Mobile is where we need more effort. And I want to spend just a minute on what happens if we don't succeed. What if all of the DWeb stuff that we're building now goes through another winter, right? So the peer-to-peer world has had multiple summers and winters now. I think it's about 2. And we are in an amazing summer today. But what happens if we fail and it goes into a winter scenario? What are the casualties? What happens? Sorry, I am terrified about that. I think it is one of the potential paths to a level of social control that we have never seen before. When you think of the technology that was available to, say, the regimes of the past that were authoritarian in that level, think of, Nazis or certain other dictatorships. The technology they had was could not root out all resistance groups. They had all kinds of resistance groups were able to exist and were able to fight back. Now we're in a world where all of the data that you need to figure out who would be susceptible to resistance thinking is right there for the taking in a social network. You can get a sense from their previous posts, you can get a sense from the people they know, from the things they like, and so on. So it is possible right now for an authoritarian government to get access to some of these treasure troves of data and just sort all of the people by how likely are they to disagree with the party. And just, find the top 0.0001% and, disappear them and keep going. And that will, first of all, send a massive chilling effect. Everybody's going to be much more repressed. But that level of control, I don't think we've ever seen before. And the degree of surveillance with cameras everywhere, with machine learning, with robotics, with drones, and so on, it's kind of terrifying. And so this could turn out pretty poorly. And so if we don't succeed, if we don't build systems of communication that are able to have the crypto shield against the massive, powerful attacker, if we don't get that in place fast, then we might have a future that is pretty dark. So this stuff is important. It's heavy, but it's important. And so just, I find it very motivating and fueling to know that that level of an important goal is there. Because, the trivial problems that you see day to day of like, oh, my code won't compile, or like, oh, I have to rewrite this library, or, oh, like this thing shipped, and like we have to add that feature. That is completely trivial with a potential future of like, wow, what if like a government, my government, or a government of my friends decides to disappear them tomorrow? That's terrifying, right? And so let's not aim towards that world. I'm running out of time, and I want to stay on time, so I'm going to move on. 42 now. It's up to you. Whether we land in those potential dark futures or the good ones, it's up to you. We didn't talk about this, which is what if we succeed but get it wrong? What if we build really cool stuff, but it actually makes it all worse? Ponder that on your own, or come talk to me later. There's potential features there, but it's still worth building. Like it is still very important to build this stuff. Just do it right. And it's up to you. I think the future's in your hands. You're incredibly powerful individuals and groups who are able to conjure superpowers and gift them to the world. It's an amazing power that you have of being able to create systems and applications and so on. It's cyber wizardry, right? Like this is totally magic and science fiction type stuff. It's up to you to avoid the bad futures and make the good futures happen. And one more thing. A thank you to Wendy. And all of the archive and event staff.
I love you. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I so love about Juan Benet is that it's not just about building tech for him. He wants to build protocol labs into the Xerox park of our day. He wants academics and thinkers and so much more than just a piece of code. And I applaud you for that. So let's hear it up. Give it up for Juan Benet. Thank you. Hey. I'm sorry I have to be so strict on time, but our time together is winding up. Hi, live stream. Thank you for being with us. And I want to make some space for this pair. Back, I think in 2011, Brewster first got interested in Bitcoin. It might have been 2009, but I think it was 2011. And so he wanted to set up a wallet at Internet Archive. So he called a young writer who he had been reading named Vitalik Buterin. And he said, hey, could you come over and set us up? And Vitalik, was living in San Francisco, and he came over and he set us all up and he explained it all to us. And then I remember hearing him speak at our Internet Archive at a meetup in 2015. Fast forward 3 years and how far Ethereum has come. I think Ethereum is one of the most interesting communities, in part because of the spirit of its leaders and the way in which it makes its decisions. They have a foundation now led by 2 new leaders who we are so pleased to have on this stage. And they want to talk to you, actually, about Decentralization by Elimination, a provocative title. Please welcome Miyaguchi and Albert Nee of the Ethereum Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. It's been very fascinating to see our friend blockchain people at this event, and then thank you for having us here at this event. It's very exciting. Like she explained, I'm also one of those people who joined this weird crypto world early back in 2013, but before that, oh, sorry. Actually, we changed the title because it was too provocative. No, it's actually, I'm going to explain this later. But, oh. It's not working.
Keep on talking, we'll get you a new.
Okay. Oh, how do I go back? Okay, my name is Miyaguchi from the Ethereum Foundation. And so I'm one of those people who's been in this for a while, meaning more than 5 years is pretty long in this industry. I first became interested in Bitcoin, like Wendy said, back in, actually originally it was 2011. But then before that, my focus at my graduate school was sustainable business, specifically financial inclusion. And I was looking for different ways to help ultra poor in the developing world. And I thought the technology of Bitcoin was revolutionary in many ways. You can transfer money like value from here to a place like Cambodia instantaneously, securely, with no cost. It was almost with no cost back then, not anymore. But so, wow, I thought this would change the way we think, the definition of money, but also how things work in financial systems. And as a former educator, I actually used to be a teacher in Japan, and what's been driving me is my passion and curiosity to death. I care about world imbalance and injustice. There are so many imbalances in the world, and then also basically I care about these issues, and I wanted to be part of the solution. As much as I admit that I'm also part of the problem, we all are just by existing. And then I met Ethereum. Then Ethereum made potential of blockchain a lot bigger and broader. And then a lot bigger and broader, but also a lot bigger and broader. And then I thought this was hope for humanity, and because of what I care. So, so blockchain has potential to provide different things. Blockchain can do a lot of exciting things. It can help give the it can help make the unbanked to be banked. It can provide identifications to refugees. It can provide optimal supply chain solutions, and it can do a lot more. But how can we get there? Oh. So the technology can be advanced by talented developers and researchers, but the problems cannot be solved without the right intention. And here today, we want to talk about this idea of a mindset of subtraction versus addition. And we all, sorry, it's missing, subtraction and versus addition. And we are all familiar with addition. Humans tend to add more things to the world. And the more people, more money, more power, more and more, we keep adding things to the world. But then there's always downsides of this addition. And more people means actually more resources, and then more money means like we are exploiting human, and then more power is creating inequality. And then this is exactly the case of the centralized power. And centralized power getting bigger means other members are getting less. And then this is exactly why we need to constantly try to subtract. And this idea of subtraction is actually not really new to me. It's pretty common in Japan, where I was born and raised. We actually have this expression built in subtraction. It's called hikizan no bigaku. If you, like for example, with Western food, when you taste something bitter or you taste something bad in food, like you try to add more sauce and then to cover it. With Japanese food, they actually try to subtract the bitterness before cooking in order to make the most out of that true taste of ingredients. And another example is with most of martial arts, you focus on the power, having more power by punches and kicks. But with Japanese Aikido, you actually try to subtract your energy or power and then almost swallow your power to actually have control of the opponent's movements. And this is really not really only thing in the Eastern world. When the Pope asked Michelangelo like how he created the statue of David, his answer is, it's simple, I just removed everything that doesn't look like David. So this is also exactly what blockchain does, and it creates decentralization and distribution, and a subtraction mindset will fully harness this potential of decentralization. And we like to talk about the history of computing and internet, and with the spirit of decentralization, I'd like to pass this to Albert, my good friend at the foundation.
With Aya at the Ethereum Foundation. And we kind of felt like, if you're going to talk about decentralization, it'd be nice to have more than one person speak, though I recognize the irony in adding a speaker to a talk about subtraction. But my background, comes from Silicon Valley, and I worked out here starting about 10 years ago, and what was interesting is, I joined a small startup. Actually, sorry, let me go back here. I joined a small startup 10 years ago, and I worked there for a little over 6 years. And by the time I left, this small startup was actually definitely not a startup anymore. In fact, it was a company that even just IPO'd earlier this year. So we felt that my background and experience would be nice to walk through some of the history of Silicon Valley and how it has influenced our thinking and this decentralization by subtraction concept. One thing I should highlight is, nothing we're talking about here is like brand new. This isn't some grand new philosophy, and if anything, we're drawing from thousands of years of ideas. What is new is the world today is different. We're in a different context, and we've learned a lot, or we've observed a lot from how it's changed in recent years. And naturally, Silicon Valley has been near the ebb and flow of how computing and decentralization and a lot of these other things have intersected with the world. So how did we get here? Obviously, I don't have time to go through every detail, but I'll race through some prior decades. As many of you probably know, the internet and Silicon Valley actually have a lot of roots in military technology, dating all the way back to the 60s. And there aren't, I think, too many more centralized, closed, and power-concentrating contexts than military technology. So naturally, the pendulum kind of only had one direction to swing in from there. You had things like Ted Nelson's Computer Lib, or the Homebrew Computer Club. Yeah, for Ted Nelson. We had the Homebrew Computer Club nearby in Menlo Park back in the 70s, and it famously, among many other things, inspired Steve Wozniak to design the Apple I. Yeah, racing forward to the 80s, we had the free software movement, which began formally, thanks in large part to Richard Stallman. The first Macintosh was also built then. And once we reached the 90s, we had Linux, but we also had a juggernaut in Microsoft. The 90s was also when, I guess, normal people started using the internet, and that led us to the dot-com bubble burst in 2000. In retrospect, the dot-com bubble burst was probably the real Y2K bug, and so, keep moving along here. Let's get to 2008. So in 2008, there was still a bit of a nuclear winter after the dot-com bubble burst. 2008 is also when I dropped out of MIT to join a startup, and even though that is pretty common nowadays, believe me when I say that all of my friends thought I was crazy at the time. And their reasoning made sense. They were like, well, how can a tiny number of people compete with these big, powerful, wealthy corporations? And I think what a lot of folks didn't understand at the time, myself included, is that startups are a medium to make it easier for small numbers of people to do bigger things. They're not the only way to do this by any means. I mean, artists and authors, and there's so many other ways. But startups have increasingly become a standard way for small groups to try to have a bigger impact. It wasn't always standard. I swear on my mother's life that I didn't even know what the word valuation meant the first 3 years I was working out here. That's obviously impossible today. So it was a bit of a different world. But looking back on it now, what I realize is that the startup world, 5-10 years ago, it was kind of the latest in a long line of spiritual successors to groups like the Homebrew Computer Club. These spiritual successors have taken on a lot of forms. Some have been more pure. Others have been more, I guess, business-oriented. But a common theme is that there was always this desire for people to build and to share. And from that standpoint, none of this is very new. Now, I think there's a lot of good things about this startup mentality. I think it's created a fair bit of good and created a lot of opportunity. I think it's valuable for people to realize that startups are an option and not a career suicide move like my friends thought 10 years ago. And I think that it's influenced a generation of builders to dream bigger and to aim higher. So what's changed? And why does it feel like, sometimes a lot of this has gone horribly wrong? There's times when it feels like maybe we're moving closer to dystopia than utopia. And part of this, I think, is actually just natural. There's a cycle to things. They're popular and then become unpopular. They're looked upon favorably and then looked upon unfavorably. So I acknowledge that that may be part of the reason. But I think that's also a lazy answer, and it's not one that I'm personally satisfied with. So I wanted to think through this and break it down more. if you think back to how startups are, in large part a medium to enable smaller groups of people to do bigger things, well, when you're talking about like a dozen people, it's pretty cool. It's almost like romantic, whether it's a story from China 400 years ago that every kid knows, or a movie that I think came out like a month and a half ago. We really like these stories where a band of brothers or sisters, usually a band of brothers, work together to, do something cool or make the world a better place. Where it takes a turn is when a small number of people run a company of thousands or tens of thousands and are able to literally influence billions. That's what, like Facebook and WeChat and Google, they're able to do. And I think it's a unique attribute of where we are in this cycle. And so it really highlights a crucial variable, which is size, right? So size is a key, and more precisely, size leads to fragility. A large, like a centralized mega entity that is able to leverage itself to the hyper extreme, the same way a startup lets a dozen or 2 dozen people leverage themselves extremely. Well, all of a sudden, this opportunity, this dream starts to look a bit like a nightmare. There's these elements of risk and fragility and liability. So yeah, it's cute when 10 people do something outsized, but it's literally world-changing and perhaps even world-endangering when it's a 10,000 person machine that has literally been hyper-optimized for sharing and engagement and learning things about you that you might not even have known about yourself. Now, to be fair, the problem isn't just size. Part of it is that there's these winner-take-all dynamics, so there aren't natural counterweights to some of these corporations or other entities. And consequently, they become kind of the only game in town, and therefore we lack balance. This is one reason why decentralization is much more than just a buzzword or a marketing gimmick to us. We feel that decentralization expresses the principle that you don't want entities or people as well to be disproportionately massive within some ecosystem. It leads to imbalance and it leads to fragility. So this drove a lot of our thinking behind this decentralization by subtraction mindset. And it's one of the reasons that we see a lot of beauty in subtraction. Now, I wanted to be a little bit more concrete about these ideas because it's extremely important for myself, for Aya, for all the people in the Ethereum ecosystem, the broader blockchain, and just decentralized web world to grasp these concepts because most of us still work in units that resemble traditional organizations. And just because an organization is part of a supposedly decentralized ecosystem doesn't mean that organization is contributing to the decentralization. Traditional organizations, even in decentralized ecosystems, are going to naturally trend or default to an addition mindset. It's just how we're wired. And so I wanted to go through some examples to contrast the mindsets. The first and most obvious example is that, with an addition mindset, you're thinking about becoming bigger instead of smaller. Now, this alone doesn't capture everything because you'll hear organizations talk all the time about wanting to become more lean, for example. So it's not just a size thing, but at the core of it, we're talking about, bigger versus smaller, addition versus subtraction. But I think other examples can highlight the difference more precisely. One of my favorite examples is how almost every organization views talent as this zero-sum game. I've worked with dozens of organizations over the past 10 years, and a very common topic is how do we fight for the best talent? How do we poach? How do we win the best people? If you're able to have a subtraction mindset, it begins to be possible to think in terms of literally giving away the best talent, something that's just unthinkable in most conventional situations. Similarly, an organization might want to become more lean, but it's almost always because they're still trying to increase their overall financial means. Obviously, revenue, just how much, what's on your balance sheet, things like that. When you have a subtraction mindset, the burden of proof flips around. Now it's like, wait, why can the balance sheet go up? Does that mean we're not doing other things like well enough? So that is another, I think, very counterintuitive ramification of this subtraction mindset. And a lot of this boils down to, are you trying to capture opportunities and the value that comes with them, or are you trying to distribute these opportunities to others? Are you trying to pull things in-house? Like, we always hear about acquisitions. We don't hear about spin-outs unless like the government literally goes in and breaks up some company. Versus maybe this group of people is going to be better enabled to do their best work if we literally push them out of the house, and even though that actually might weaken our organization. And one thing that's really fascinating to me is when people are unhappy that value is created by others, because it means that you missed an opportunity. When you have a subtraction mindset, value creation becomes a burden. It means that you're doing something because no one else was doing it and you had to do it. And that means when others are creating the value that you were hoping to see be created, you're not unhappy, you're thrilled. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from HBO's Silicon Valley show, where Gavin Belson, he's the CEO of the fictional Big Corp, he says, "I don't want to live in a world where someone else makes the world a better place better than we do." This is a fictional quote, but I bet if you sprinkled, truth serum on a lot of the people out here in Silicon Valley, they would say something similar to this. And obviously, in a subtraction mindset, you're not thinking in these terms anymore. So this brings me to one of my final examples, and I think this is a really fascinating nuance, which is a subtraction mindset literally means seeking to decrease the prestige, whether it's of you as an individual or of your organization. Take universities, for example. They're not necessarily trying to get bigger. People flow in and out. Some have pretty big endowments, but they generally are focused on education and not necessarily increasing their bank balance. But universities are undoubtedly looking to increase their prestige, not to decrease it. A lot of these groups, they're ultimately looking to matter more, not matter less. And to have a true decentralization by subtraction mindset, you're going to need to be able to want to matter less. It's not easy, because where does this lead us to ultimately? It leads us to this contrast. In an addition mindset, there's nothing more catastrophic than the thought of being eliminated. Whereas in a subtraction mindset, I don't know, it might actually be the ultimate goal. So hopefully some of these examples help you think more about how to apply the subtraction mindset. And speaking of subtraction mindset, I'm going to get off the stage now and hand it back to Aya, who will talk about how some of this applies to her work.
5 minutes. Okay, I will run this quick. So Albert is an example of how we work within this foundation. He could have earned any title at the foundation, but he refused to do so. He's just Albert. And then we have those amazing talent who have brilliant experience and background, but we just work together where we need to work. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about how we do things at the foundation. So there's, as you know, there's hierarchy, corporate structure, and there's also a very flat startup structure that was invented in the Silicon Valley, San Francisco. And then the startup way was very new, and those two were very different. And startup way attracted a lot of talents, young talents. But both of those had the same goal, to grow bigger. When I joined the foundation this year, there was a natural kind of pressure or request to grow the foundation bigger and add more. And I thought, okay, maybe that was what I was supposed to do. But the more I learned about people at the foundation, but also the community, I felt that was something wrong. I didn't feel that was the right thing to do. And then I realized that there were now clear boundaries between the foundation people within the foundation, but also outside of the foundation, because all the projects are open source, and then it's done by a lot of volunteers outside of the foundation, and also work with the people within the foundation. So at the Ethereum Foundation, but also we see this as a within the entire ecosystem. We aim to grow small, and that doesn't mean we don't hire, but we only, like, hiring is only for the part that the only foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, can do within this big Ethereum ecosystem. And as the industry or as the ecosystem grows, we become a tiny part of the entire ecosystem. That's what we are already, but also that's what we aim to do. And we see the entire ecosystem as constellation of a lot of different players. There are developers, researchers, businesses, and this can be also categorized by what we improve, such as scalings, security or usability or privacy. And also this can be categorized by who is affected by our work, such as the end users, the apps, enterprise, government, or nonprofits. And these are all stars that are connected by the way they work, solutions, or the impact. And then we are the coordinator of this entire constellation, and we just coordinate the communication, and also sometimes empower each star to actually also let other stars empower others. And giving grants is, of course, our main activity. And how we give grants is also in a decentralized way. We let other members in the community or work with other members of the community to identify what are the missing pieces of development and research work, and also let others to make decision who should work on these pieces, and also let others or work with others to fund or empower those individuals or organizations to work on these pieces. And so there are multiple funding mechanisms within the ecosystem, and it is okay, or it's actually great. We do not care where the money is from, as long as we are creating positive impact to the ecosystem. So at the end of the day, Ethereum is an open source project that has been supported by a lot of volunteer contributors, and Ethereum has been successful because of this continuous effort to stay decentralized. And then we have to continuously work to subtract ourselves by the core members, but also the foundation has to continuously do that. And yeah, so through blockchain or decentralization or whatever you're working on now, I hope like you can take this, the beauty of subtraction, to your work. Thank you very much.
Albert, come on out. Thank you. We're going to bring our last speaker of this set out, but let's hear a big round of applause for Aya and Albert. Excellent. They're going to be around and you can talk to them. John, come on up here with me, because we have very little time. We need to reset the clock, guys, too. No. Could you set the clock at 10, as I think we discussed? You know, you're probably wondering why we're going to end with a librarian, somebody who is from the library world. And many of you know that the Internet Archive is actually a digital library. And libraries are incredibly important to us because librarians and libraries are sharers of knowledge. They're some of the most trusted organizations on earth. And these are times when we need people we can trust. So with very little more said, I want to introduce one of the people that we admire most, one of our greatest allies, John Bracken, the Executive Director of the DPLA.
Thank you, Wendy. You started to give my talk. That was great. You should stay. Can I just make a suggestion for those of us in the room? I've seen some yawns and some stretches. For those who want to stand up and give a little stretch, feel free. You guys have been sitting for a long while. Those of you at home that want to stand up and stretch, you can do that too. I saw, we're in that kind of post-lunch, not enough caffeine space. And I actually don't have a clicker. If someone has a clicker, I can start. I'm not even delaying intentionally to give my talk, but I won't be able to advance my slides for now. So if someone's got a tool for me to advance my slides, or if you guys are able to advance the slides from back there, I'll just give you a point and ask you to do it. So my name's John Bracken. I'm with, as Wendy said, the Digital Public Library of America, and I'm going to start off with a story, something that we all have, which is a story about a library. One thing you learn when you're running a library is everyone has an individual library story that they want to share with you. This is mine. This is the Monroe Street branch in Madison, Wisconsin. It was very important to me, especially at a moment in my childhood. The summer my father died, I spent a lot of time at this library diving deep into Jack Kerouac and Bruce Springsteen and Stevie Wonder records. And what I want to talk about is the ways in which that memory, that nostalgia that we all have, that library story, is not enough. That the values and principles that libraries bring to society require us to think differently and more creatively than that safe, trusted memory that we all have about the libraries. But it's not enough for us to just, love the libraries. We need to help, especially those of us on Team Internet, need to help the libraries, rethink and reimagine what we can do and what we can be. And we need to develop some new muscles. So, my master's thesis in 1998 was part of a larger project looking at how the internet in 1998 was being presented to parents. What were the messages that parents were receiving about the internet? And the message was twofold. It was sort of schizophrenic. On the one, now, if those of you old enough to remember, this was the era when we were all getting the AOL discs in the mail. A lot of people were feeling confusion. They were putting it in. As parents, the message was, you need to be online. You need to put that disc in. You need to download AOL or whatever it is. And if your kids aren't online, they're going to fall behind. Also, the internet's a scary, terrible place, and you should be terrified if your kids are online. Right? So it was this weird dual schizophrenic message. Today, in 2018, as the parent of an 8.5-year-old, that schizophrenic message still resonates. I'm so excited my daughter's playing in Minecraft and in Roblox. I'm terrified when she starts chatting with her friends or others. And as someone who's studied this for 20 years, I'm terrified. I can only imagine what everyone else is we're all sort of negotiating this together. One thing we found in 1998 is that libraries were the top resource that people looked to for help and guidance to figure out what all these discs that were showing up in the mail were about. And over the last 20 years, libraries have become a place, especially for Americans who don't have access, who don't have America Online, or who need a boost to access the internet, including through projects like this hotspot to access the internet from home by checking out devices. At a time when we are worried about the loss of common space, libraries are a radically open place where anyone can come, where everyone shows up. There are more libraries in the US than there are McDonald's. There are actually 8 times as many libraries in the US as there are McDonald's. This is a shot of LA Public Library where they sort of hacked the traditional mural in the main branch with a more contemporary one. Libraries allow us to help remember, right? They allow us to help remember the past, and they allow us to think about the future, they allow us to think about today through the future's eyes, right? How do we go about archiving, and how do we think about what's happening today as a future memory? They're places where we can play with new types of storytelling, engage with new technologies in ways that are inaccessible for many of us from home, learn new skills. They're a platform for others to collaborate with. Over the last couple of years, the MIT Media Lab has initiated a project. They've seen libraries, public libraries in particular, as a great opportunity to engage and create a two-way conversation between Media Lab projects and students and public libraries. So this is happening within a context in which a lot of us are reconsidering and thinking critically, and it's a core to a lot of the conversations we've been having here this week, the role of the internet and democracy. We've learned, it's been revealed to us even more explicitly in recent months, the ways in which the internet can be weaponized against democracy. And as we go forward, I think it's incumbent upon us to think through what lessons, as we're literally having conversations today about is the American experiment with democracy is it going to continue? Is it going to survive? As we're having those conversations, it's important for us to look to the past. So Andrew Carnegie, we might not have a public library system in this country were it not for Andrew Carnegie. He helped build over 2,000 libraries in his time. One of the things he did is he thought very critically about technology. When Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh came to him and they wanted to build a new main public library, he said, well, have you considered the arrival of the horseless carriage, which will be coming down the pike in the next 10 years? That's going to change the way people engage with the physical space. It's going to change the way you need to design and think about your space. And I think that's one of the things that we collectively need to help ask and provoke to our civic institutions today. The Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates, their first philanthropic project was wiring America's libraries. The Gates Foundation touched 95% of America's libraries across the US. Very few of our projects, I think civically, can take that kind of a claim. And I think today, one of the things we're seeing is there's an opportunity for the next Carnegie, the next Gate, to get in and help support the core infrastructure that we need if we're going to survive as a democracy in a digital age. One of the areas in which libraries and a lot of us, including our friends and family at the archive, have been engaged is ways in which new knowledge is being conveyed in new formats. Ebooks is one. One of the areas we've been working on is an open source product that tool called Simply E that New York Public Library started. We work with it with a bunch of friends. But one of the things that I think it's incumbent upon these civic institutions to do is to develop the realization that things are not standing still, right? Just as the gaming industry looks radically different than it did 40 years ago, the ways in which knowledge are conveyed are not necessarily going to look like one more. Like that in the next 10 or 20 years. The creators of tomorrow aren't necessarily going to be building text or thinking the way that we, us old folks, are thinking. Hebrew Brown is an artist in Chicago. His most iconic character is Flyboy. He's emblematic of the new emergent creators who are thinking in multiple platforms, thinking in digital ways, thinking YouTube first before text. And it's incumbent upon us, if we care about civic values, for the libraries and for all of us to help think through more critically, what do we need to do differently? What muscles do we need to approach so that we're at the table and are informing the new knowledge platforms that the creators and consumers of tomorrow are going to be building? If we don't, if these civic institutions don't make that addition and don't make that shift, my fear is if we don't have those values, if we don't have the place-based aspect, the grounded in every neighborhood in the US, if we don't have access to the professionally trained, skilled librarians who specialize in information curation, and if we lose these institutions that are the most trusted civic institutions in the US, as Wendy said, our digital future may actually be worse than our analog past. And I think that's a future we don't want to walk down. Thank you so much. Thank you, Wendy, and the archive for having us.
You know what? We ate up that whole break. So we're going to bring out the final panel of the final day of the Decentralized Web Summit. Thanks for sticking with us, live streamers. Let's bring them out, and we will rejoin you on the live stream in just a second. The final panel is Cryptocurrency and the Law. You want to stick around for that one. We'll be back in a minute. Hello, hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the live stream. You are at the final session of the final day of the Decentralized Web Summit 2018. We're here on the front end stage with a very interesting and illustrious panel. This is Cryptocurrency and the Law. You know, I think you probably have noticed that we have talked very little about cryptocurrency. Our feeling at the Internet Archive was this. If you want to talk about crypto and blockchain, there is about a panel a week that you could go to. We wanted to talk about something very different. And yet, how many of you out there have started a coin? Yeah? How many of you are thinking maybe that's a good way to get some funding and incentive in there? Yeah, so you're thinking about it. This is why you're out there, and I can just imagine our virtual audience as well. If you are going to do this, you should be aware that there are laws and policies and lots of things you need to think about. So we assembled a really interesting panel, two folks who have actually launched their own coin. The gentleman who's considered kind of the guru of all legal maneuvering around coin. A general counsel, Marvin Ammori, who represents Protocol Labs, and Althea Allen, who is with Omise Go. She knows more about this world than just about anyone, I have found. And so Ryan Shea, co-founder of Blockstack, he has gone through this. Zooko Wilcox, co-founder of Zcash, certainly has gone through it. So practical experience, legal knowledge, someone who's in the trenches, and somebody who knows the space, they're going to answer your questions about cryptocurrency and the law. Take it away.
Is this on? Okay. Nobody actually told me how to turn it on. So thank you very much, Wendy. I'm going to make this intro fairly brief because we don't have a ton of time. But in my role at Omise Go, I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can sort of coexist with the wider ecosystem, with the DWeb ecosystem, and just sort of make a contribution and have relationships that are mutually beneficial between us and other projects and other institutions. So I think that ties right in with what we're talking about today, which is how do we push forward with our ideals and our goals of decentralization, privacy, autonomy, and hopefully moving forward with the regulatory frameworks that exist perhaps most complicatedly in the United States, although it's something that we're grappling with all over the world. But so I would like to start with Peter, just to get sort of a general overview of where things are at right now, some of the main concepts that need to be understood in order to like follow the conversation that we're about to have. Maybe starting with the idea of security regulation and the Howey test, because I think that a lot of the problems that we grapple with in the US in particular really start there.
Sure. So I don't know if anyone was in the room for Jennifer Granick's talk in the morning session. She said she has like a love-hate relationship with the United States and their policy towards the internet and decentralized technologies. And I think that's right. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the most complicated and most hostile jurisdiction for these tools. It's just really a mixed bag. You have really robust protections, constitutional protections for things like free speech, to some extent for privacy and a warrant requirement, although as Jennifer was saying this morning, we're fighting back to claw back an expectation of privacy from the third-party doctrine, where when you hand your information over to a company, you lose privacy. Although maybe if you hand it over to a decentralized network, you don't actually hand it over to a third party, and so we can actually restore that constitutional provision without the law changing, just with the ecosystem changing. So that just as a preface. Covering the landscape from a regulatory standpoint, you're right, the securities laws are a hot topic, and I think it's a hot topic because so many people seeing the success of Bitcoin as a technology and as an asset class, and the fact that it's open source, decided that, well, hey, I could take that code, change it, make it do other things, so it's not just decentralized money transmission or decentralized value storage, it's now decentralized file storage, or maybe it's still value transmission, but it's more private, like with Zcash or Monero. So many people have wanted to build these new networks, and at the start of the new network, there's this question, okay, how are we going to get the token out there? And could we maybe actually raise money to build the new network by selling the token, which would be a novel new way of building a company, building a protocol, building a public good that doesn't necessarily require taking money from venture capitalists who would then necessarily want a lot of control over your business and may not like the idea of it being an open protocol, may want it to end up more like Facebook, which defeats the point. But so that all sounds great. That's the positive spin on all this, like tokens. There are a lot of interesting projects that might get funded this way. The downside potentially is when you sell a token and you have people who are buying it with an expectation of profits and they're relying on you to deliver on that expectation, you might run afoul of securities laws. And that's because in the US, we have a flexible standard for what it means to issue a security. Specifically, this Howey case, or this Howey test that you mentioned. And the Howey, yeah, oh, please.
I think it's worth pointing out why, the motivation for the law. So one of the downsides is you might run afoul of securities law, but another downside is you might get ripped off by some fraudulent scheme that tricked you into thinking you were buying into a new technology.
Yeah.
And that's why securities law.
Right, so these things are not just there to bother technologists. These are not just roadblocks. They're really there for investor protection purposes. They're calibrated, though, for an older type of investor and an older type of promoter. And some projects from today would definitely benefit from those same protections, and maybe some others wouldn't. And I think a lot of it has to do with how centralized or decentralized the group building the token is. But just to make this tangible for the audience, the Howey case is a case about an orange grove where somebody in Florida was selling off tracts of land, and people were buying the land, like they got a deed to the land, but they also signed a contract with the seller, Howey, where Howey promised to make the land fruitful, to grow the oranges in the orange grove for them, and to sell them at a market for profits. And so land is not a security, just as maybe tokens may not be securities because they're really just like a system resource on a network. But the non-security nominal asset, the token or the land, combined with promises, the promise by Howey to grow oranges and sell them for profit at market, or in the case of a token launch, the tokens plus promises to make the network work better in the future, could be a security under the same tests that worked back in the 1950s for orange groves. The same test could work today with respect to tokens.
Okay, following up on that, in a conversation leading up to this panel, you brought up sort of the analogy or the characterization of the uncanny valley in terms of deciding whether current laws apply to crypto projects or aspects of cryptocurrencies. You explained that very well, and I would love to have you do that again.
So the uncanny valley is this idea from computer graphics and like movie special effects, where if you have human personages on screen and they're like just close enough to looking like a real person, but they still look like an artificial, like a drawing, they're creepier than like an obvious cartoon. Like there's this bad valley in between. With regulation, I think there's a metaphor here in that I think the projects that have the least problem with securities laws are projects like Bitcoin, where it's quite clearly something entirely different than traditional securities issuance, because it's this massive network of people. No one is clearly discernible as the person who people are relying upon, and the token was never even sold in an initial distribution to investors. It emerged through mining. It's so radically not a security that I don't think they have too many issues. And then on the other end of the spectrum, people who are working on blockchain technology but have traditional looking businesses, i.e. they want to just use blockchain technology to trade securities, like instead of the DTCC and NASDAQ, we'll use a blockchain. Their compliance road is pretty clear. You are definitely doing securities. In the middle is where I think there's issues, kind of like that uncanny valley, where the project is more centralized than Bitcoin, but less like a typical financial institution than somebody who wants to trade securities on a blockchain. That area is hard for the law to grapple with because you look a little bit like something that's heavily regulated, but you're not quite there.
So we're really, I think, in early stages with grappling with a lot of these questions, I think, and with sort of finding out how things are going to play out with as actual regulations shift and new rules are made or reinterpreted. And Marvin, you've been there for a lot of these cases, and I would love to hear you weigh in on some of like what you think are the most important rulings in recent years and sort of what they mean, or rulings and opinions.
Sure,
because
sure.
Some of them are less clear than that.
Sure. While Peter was talking, I felt like I needed to explain how lawyers think. So when lawyers go to law school, we tend to read cases from like the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s about different businesses, sea wrecks at sea, and prisoners who stole foxes, and then we think. It's often not like a first principles kind of scientific, like logical analysis or deduction. It's analogies. We think in terms of analogies. The lawyers, if you bring them something at the SEC and you say, here's a token or something, they'll say, what box do I fit it in? Does it fit in the securities box, the debt box? They like analogies. And 20 years ago at the beginning of like the internet litigation, There was a famous case called Reno v. ACLU, where the Supreme Court, like all 9 justices, were asking, is the internet like a shopping mall? Is it like someone on a soapbox? Is it like a TV? And the New York Times headline was, 9 justices in search of a metaphor. And over the years, all of the lawyers that came to courts saying, this is totally new and different, man, the old laws shouldn't apply, they would lose. You'd have to go in and you'd have to say, this is like a trespass to real property, not like a trespass to non-real property. You have to come up with some analogy or some argument. And so, so just in terms of analogies, that's how we think. And so in terms of the most major guidance that's come out, you know, there have been a few things that have come out of the SEC. There was an opinion about something called the DAO, but I think the most interesting guidance from the SEC kind of interprets the Howey case for Ethereum. And so you can probably explain this better than anyone if you want to talk about the Bill Hinman speech. It's kind of the guidance that if I were like to have 2 things dog-eared on my bedstand, right? It would be like, you know, the Howey case from the Supreme Court and also the Hinman speech in terms of guidance for how to have a token issuance or a token delivery. I think I'll hand it over to you again.
Sure. So Director Hinman is the head of Corp Fin, which is the division within the SEC that's going to make policy in this space. They decide, in a certain sense, what the SEC's official opinion will be with respect to anything being a security or not being a security. And that will decide whether you're regulated by the SEC or not. And Director Hinman gave a speech about 2 months ago now that said that certain cryptocurrencies, and he did mention Bitcoin and he mentioned Ethereum, do not look like they would benefit from securities regulation, and they do not look like they would fit the relevant test, the Howey test for securities regulation, for 2 reasons. They are functional, so a stock certificate doesn't do anything in the world. It's a dead piece of paper. It affords you legal rights to profits, but it doesn't do anything beyond that. You know, maybe you get a vote as a shareholder, but it doesn't do anything beyond that. Whereas a Bitcoin does something. It allows you to write a transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain, which is actually quite an amazing technological feat. You understand the double spending problem in computer science, and you understand why digital cash for the internet could be great for liberty and human flourishing. Having a Bitcoin gives you that ability in a way that having a stock certificate doesn't give you any ability. It has a function. And this is what Hinman's talking about in that speech, functionality. But he's also talking about something else, decentralization. So it's interesting, we're going to decentralize the web conference, and a regulator related to securities laws is using the term decentralization. I was listening earlier, somebody was saying, it's not just a buzzword. And a lot of lawyers looking at Hinman's speech actually thought, well, why are they using these buzzwords now? But it actually fits right by analogy, like Marvin said, into the existing case law. The Howey case was a case where just owning land, you're not relying on anybody. Land is decentralized. Land, it just exists in the world. You see it out there, and nobody is there necessarily making the land exist for you. It's just there. It's out there in the world. You're going to need a deed and other things to perfect your claim, but to hoe the land and to plant crops in there, it's just there. It's part of the fabric of the world because it's decentralized in a way. Nobody owns all the land in the world. Now we could talk about nation states and sovereignty, but that's a little strange in sci-fi. And what made the land a security was the centralized relationship between the investor and Howey, the person who was promising to make the land profitable for the investor, promising to keep growing the oranges that were in the orange grove, selling the oranges at market, and giving you the profits. And so Director Hinman, when he's in his speech talking about decentralization, is saying, within the Bitcoin or the Ethereum ecosystems, there is no one person or even a discernible group of persons upon whose substantial efforts the holder of the token is relying for their profits, any more than there is one discernible person in the world that somebody who owns a piece of gold relies on somebody for their profits. Gold is just something that exists decentralized in the world. It's just something you can hold in your hand, and it has market prices. And that's really where the value of Bitcoin or Ether comes from. Sure, there's all sorts of developers and people in the ecosystem that contribute to the value of that, but they're decentralized. There's no one of them that matters substantially more than all the rest. And so that framework for looking at securities regulation, I think, is spot on. And these aren't buzzwords. This is just a gloss on the Howey test. This is just, is there an expectation of profits? Sure, but it's also something that people might buy to use it because it's functional. And is there reliance on a third-party promoter? No. There's reliance on thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of third parties. And so you can't really find the kind of centralized reliance that you'd expect in a security. So passing that test with respect to these new ideas, Bitcoin and Ethereum, to Director Hinman, don't look like they'd benefit from securities regulation where you have a centralized promoter who needs to do disclosures, who needs to do investor protection.
Does that Does that interpretation change at all when you're talking about an ICO that launches prior to the project launching? So you talked about like gold, but if there's sort of a goose that lays golden eggs, for a little while you have to wait for the goose to lay the egg, and then the egg is just out there in the world. So is there kind of a gray area, or where do these interpretations change in that sort of waiting period?
I think there's lots of gray areas, and Coin Center, we published a 60-page framework where we explain the different gradations of the gray here. The thing that would look more like a security would be something that seems to have very little or no functionality because it doesn't even exist yet, and is being developed by a small group of people, not an ecosystem, and maybe is even being developed as a proprietary closed source project. At that point, we're obviously completely reliant on that one person and the promises they're making to their purchasers. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have highly distributed projects like Bitcoin, where the code is open source, there's a community of developers, and no one's selling them with any like real promises of profits.
I can say something else, which I actually learned from Peter, but I figured it'd be more fun if I talked. Yes, which was, so this speech by Hinman gave a couple of examples of things that the SEC thought weren't securities, which was Bitcoin and Ethereum, and it gave interesting reasons. Decentralization is a really interesting reason, which makes me queasy because nobody knows what it is, including them and including me. So I don't know how lawyers handle that when you're supposed to go into court with an undefined word as part of your argument. But anyway, but the SEC has also given us a lot of examples of things that they think are securities because they've gone and like taken legal action against all these people. And all of the ones, to my knowledge, that they've targeted were scams, were like fraudulent schemes where they tricked people into thinking that they were buying cryptocurrencies or something, when in fact they were just taking the money and fleeing with it.
Yeah, in regards to the decentralization point, I think there's a lot of different ways that we could think about decentralization, but it seems to me that specifically more what we're talking about is the social decentralization in terms of what is the extent to which, as you were saying, Peter, there is reliance upon a single party, single individual, single, group, and less, on the one end of the spectrum versus there not being a central promoter, or, and so on and so forth. So I think that we can think of decentralization across multiple dimensions. It can be social, it can be more like technological, like number of nodes, it can be like distribution of currency. I think those things are probably, it seems less important. Mechanism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And less relevant specifically to the Howey test, it seems like. Yeah. More so, if you just examine how it looks, of course I'm not a lawyer, but based on what it seems like, it's more along the lines of the social mechanics and the social realities of what's actually happening, right?
I mean, there's commonality though too. Yeah, I think as developers who want to build systems that are failure resistant, censorship resistant, don't have choke points, you're going to be more rigorous, I think, than maybe the kind of tests that we're kind of groping at with respect to decentralization in the law. Because you want to build a system that doesn't die, that doesn't get taken down, that it will always be resistant to state control. And so any kind of chink in that decentralized armor is deadly. Whereas when we're talking about securities regulation, we're just talking about to find one person in the community and make them responsible for doing investor protection disclosures. Tell me who that person would be in Bitcoin. Is it Peter Todd? Is it Greg Maxwell? Would they be a fair embodiment and capable of writing down all of the risks associated with Bitcoin? No. There isn't a person like that with respect to Bitcoin. It's just too big and too varied. There might be a person like that with respect to a small team that's building something new that hasn't even launched it yet and has accepted a lot of money from its investors. At that point, that kind of...
So you're saying investor protection disclosure. So you're saying, because I was wondering, why is the SEC talking about decentralization? It's probably not for the reasons I talk about it, which, as you say, are things like resilience against different types of attacks. What's the reason? And also efficiency, inefficiency, et cetera. Software engineering reasons. What would the reason be? But the SEC is all about investor protection, right? Is there anything else they're about?
Capital formation.
What's that?
That's trying to encourage people to be able to raise money for their projects here in the US, although you don't want to...
Supporting the economy, right?
Yeah, if you're an agency that does a little bit to promote capital formation, but fails to protect investors, you're going to be in trouble for failing. So they focus on the investor protection part.
And mostly about specifically, there's an important point here, which is that by protecting investors, it's assumed that you promote capital formation.
But
right?
by overprotecting investors, you might limit capital formation by
yes.
making it too expensive to raise money because you have to jump through so many hoops. Yeah.
Yes.
So if they bring up the word decentralization, I guess they're thinking of it as some kind of investor protection. So what you're saying is it's who should be required to do disclosures and write down all the ways that this investment might turn out to be a bad investment.
And if you can't find someone to be
another way you might think of it is information asymmetry. If it's a you could say to yourself, if it's a decentralized thing, then there isn't anybody who's like the insider and knows or can control the asset, and therefore we don't have to worry about that person taking advantage of the investors and ripping them off.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, Director Hinman mentions information asymmetries in his speech. Yeah.
So in the speech, getting back to your initial question about timing, right? You mentioned what happens when you initially launch versus later when you're more decentralized. And so when Protocol Labs pre-sold Filecoin tokens, we thought very long and hard about how to do that in a legally compliant way. At the time, a lot of people believed that you could sell tokens, for a network that hadn't been built yet, the same way you could pre-sell a CD on Kickstarter. Right? That was the analogy in their head. And then the question is that the right way to think of it, or is it more like a securities when it's not functional yet, relies on the efforts of others? And we decided that we would do the sale as a security, follow a standard exemption, only sell it to accredited investors, and we kind of published our thinking, which was, essentially it wasn't decentralized yet, it relied on Protocol Labs, and it wasn't functional yet, but we thought eventually we would deliver a network where the token was not a security, but a commodity, kind of like, a laundry token or some other kind of token out there that you could use. So partly because, we want the entire community to flourish, we published our thinking. We published a SAFT white paper, simple agreement for future tokens. We open sourced our documents, our legal documents, so other people could look at them and use them. We published this alongside a law firm called Kahle. I know that when it came out, Coin Center over here wrote that it was a reasonable approach. It was a pretty conservative approach. We simply complied with the securities laws. And in the year between that sale and the Hinman speech, I think there was a lot of uncertainty out there. And talking to lawyers in this space is so frustrating, because what you really want to do, if you're a lawyer at a company or not a lawyer and you call outside counsel, you really want to have a simple standard answer. Like when you raise venture capital, there's an established way of doing it. You can use the Orrick docs or the Gunderson docs or the Wilson-Sonsini docs. They all say the same thing. There's no lawyer that's going to violently disagree with some other lawyer about a way to do this. But in that interim of about a year, there are all these people who are coming up with their own strategies for how to do it. I think the Hinman speech really kind of provided a lot of comfort. A lot of the approaches out there were doing the right thing, at least in the initial sale, treating it as a security and knowing that it could eventually be a not a security. So now the hard question comes, how do you know that when you deliver the token, it's actually not a security, right? How decentralized and functional does Filecoin have to be before I can deliver it to someone and say, this is not a security? And so this is why I have Hinman's speech dog-eared on my bedstand. And the last year, we would give analogies like, hey, is my token more like an orange in the orange grove, or is it more like real estate? Now everyone will ask, am I as decentralized and functional as Ethereum was on the day Bill Hinman gave his speech? Right? If I'm more decentralized and functional than Ethereum on the day Bill Hinman gave his speech, then by analogy here, this should be decentralized and not a security.
It's worth noting that Director Hinman said, putting aside any initial fundraising, Ether as it trades today doesn't look like a security to me. And so he very deliberately, signposted, I'm not talking about their pre-sale. That might have been, and he didn't say that it was, but that might have been securities issuance. That the sort of agreement for one day you'll have Ether if you give the Ethereum Foundation money now might or might not be a security. He was just talking about Ether as it existed that day.
And we took a similarly conservative approach as Filecoin, and we're actually Filecoin and Blockstack were two of the first projects that did a sale that was to accredited investors only. We both went through CoinList. We were the two projects that used that platform, and our approach was our position is it's not Blockstack tokens. They're called stacks. They're not a security, but due to an abundance of caution, we are complying with all securities laws. We're extremely conservative in that respect. We did our sale, $50 million sale to only accredited investors, and then in addition to that, it was very important to us to make sure that we were able to involve members of the community who were not accredited investors. So we also had this voucher program where we would give out vouchers to non-accredited investors, and it was a completely non-binding agreement. Either side could, it's not a full agreement. Either side could decide not to honor it, but it allowed those participants to have something, and potentially at some point in the future, at which point, if the tokens are definitively deemed to not be securities, the voucher could be redeemed for tokens. So our approach was to balance both the conservative approach and making sure we were completely compliant with securities laws, and at the same time making sure that we could involve non-accredited investors in some way in the process.
The accredited investors issue comes up because if you do either concede that what you're selling is a security, or in your case, you don't think it is, but out of an abundance of caution, you want to follow the same protocols that you would if it was a security, you could do a public sale, an IPO, and sell to the general public. But that is a massive filing. There are a lot of unanswered questions as to whether you could IPO a token versus just more typical equity. An easier way to comply, and a fair one that is an exemption that plenty of non-token and cryptocurrency companies take advantage of, is by selling only to accredited investors, which means people who have over $1 million net worth or 2 years of income over 200,000. It does cut across the grain, though, of the idea that these networks should be owned by everybody and not just by the rich. And so I think what Ryan's talking about, and in general, I think what most of the token projects have been trying to do is walk that balance. How can we still be fair and equitable and get this possibly essential future resource on the internet into as many hands as possible without running the risk that we harm poor people or poorer people, and without running the risk that we run afoul of securities laws?
I have a question.
And without running the risk that we don't give many people the opportunity to participate.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question. How is this relevant to all the people in the room that aren't considering selling their own token in order to fund their project? What effect is it going to have? How's it going to matter if you're building something on top of Bitcoin or Ethereum or Zcash, or I don't know? What else do you need to know about all this securities law stuff? I guess what it boils down to is that Bitcoin and Ethereum aren't likely to get banned by the SEC in the US anytime soon. Oh, by the way, Zcash isn't either. But maybe some other cyber coins might get prevented from being tradable on the markets, and that might change something.
Yeah, so that's actually a great transition. I was going to say maybe we should move away from securities law because although it's really central to...
No, let's talk about securities law some more.
I suspect that not all people in this room are deeply interested in specifically securities regulations. So I would love to hear from the three of you who have closer connections to actual token launches, because Blockstack, Filecoin, Zcash all took completely different approaches to trying to strike this balance between being compliant with regulations and then also having the ICO reach its full potential of being a way for people to have stake in the success of a project without having ownership in the traditional sense, since that's exactly what we are trying to move away from. So maybe Zooko, we could start with you.
What's the question?
The question is, so Zcash didn't actually do a token sale or an ICO, right? And there was no pre-mine. You just began mining Zcash, and the sort of revenue model, or the way that you funded the project, was to take a percentage of the Zcash that was mined for a certain period of time. Right. So can you just tell me kind of the thought process? We were making
that decision about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, shortly after Ethereum had their ICO, and that was very successful. They made millions and millions of dollars so that they had all the money they needed to go and develop Ethereum. And we thought, oh, wow, maybe we should do that too. But we had conflicting considerations. One was the risk of later having securities law problems once the SEC found out about all this stuff. The other was, it seemed like a little bit of a morally tenuous position to be selling something that I had all the information about, right? Like, I'm going to meet someone, I'm going to explain to them about this thing, and then if they believe what I tell them, they're going to give me some money, but they have no one else that they could ask for an alternate opinion about this thing, because I'm the only person who knows anything about this thing, right? And so it felt a little bit sketchy to be taking a whole bunch of money, like Ethereum raised $10 million or so.
Small potatoes compared to ICOs to this
year.
At
the time, it was a lot of money.
It was a lot then, though, yeah.
And it like seemed 17, 18?
I think it was 18.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was 18 at that moment, yeah. Anyway, so I felt a little bit uncomfortable with taking a whole bunch of money from people that I didn't know who they were, how sophisticated they were, or like if they could afford to lose this. Because after all, the thing I was about to do could well completely fail, and then they would lose that. But then on the other hand, as you were alluding to, it's a really great technique to have an ICO in order to let a lot of people have a part, have a stake, have the ability to transact and to use the thing right away at the very beginning. So anyway, we ended up deciding on the not doing the ICO side. So we had to make do with relatively a lot less money to fund development. And it's always been a relief ever since that whenever these SEC, like parsing the meaning of the words that the SEC people use, I don't have to care very much because we didn't.
You're so good at it, though, Zooko. You just gave exactly the rationale for securities law, which is information asymmetries, and you explained it personally with respect to your project.
Oh yeah, it's really fun, but I don't have to. I don't have to worry about it because since we never sold anything to the public, no one could accuse us of having cheated them by selling them that thing. But we also, it's one of the ways that people, a lot of people from sort of a certain faction don't like Zcash, and they perceive it as centralized, ironically, and corporate, is that we didn't have an ICO, and now that it's successful, that means the public didn't have an opportunity to participate in the upside. But of course, at the time, I also wanted to protect the public from the downside, and you can't have just one without the other. So,
So the other interesting aspect there, though, is that when doing this, you didn't have much of an idea how profitable it was going to be, or like how much 20% was going to turn out to be and what you would have to work with going forward, and it turned out to be quite a bit. Yeah. But it could just as easily have turned out to be nothing, and I wonder sort of what your considerations were going in and looking back, knowing what you know now, if you would have done it the same.
I mostly have done it the same. There's this really neat idea that Vitalik Buterin told me, but too late. We had already set everything in motion when he mentioned this, which is you could have the amount of funding that you give to the developers be determined by the proof of work difficulty, because the proof of work difficulty is a proxy for the price, right? If once the price of thing goes up by 10x, then eventually the amount of investment into mining will tend to go up.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that there are people in this room who don't know what proof of work is. Could you give just like a very brief, tiny concept?
Basically, I'm just saying you pointed out a really interesting issue, which is that we had to configure these consensus rules 2 years ago for how much money goes where. And then the price of Zcash and of all coins became much, much, much higher than anyone thought 2 years ago they would have. So now that 20% funding is a lot. It's like way more than anyone thought it would be. And 2 years ago, Vitalik Buterin suggested to me a hack that would have made it possible for the amount of funding to increase less than 10 times when the price increases 10 times.
Because they'd actually be inversely related. If the difficulty goes really high, we assume the price is high, so the reward to the developer should be a little bit less of the whole.
So like a decreasing percentage of
like
as the price goes up.
Like the goal,
so cool.
I know, he's so brilliant, but he was brilliant too late. If he had told me like 3 months earlier, we might have been able to do it. But the goal would be to make it so that if the price, so if...
We were considering something similar, but we were kind of worried that it would actually deviate.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's actually period.
I think you were considering it because I told you.
It's
you
possible.
and I talked about
it. It could create perverse incentives too, potentially. Like the more successful the thing gets, the less money the developers get.
Okay, but the goal, which I don't know how to do in a decentralized, secure way, would be to make it so that if worldwide the thing goes from being worth $100 million to being worth $1 billion, that doesn't mean the developers need to get paid 10 times as much in their salaries, right? But it does mean they need to get paid more, like double as much, right? So they can hire more developers to maintain it better. See what I'm saying? So it would be cool if you could have it increase, but not that much.
It would be. I think I'm going to move to Ryan. Could you touched on it briefly earlier, but tell us about your distribution model, but I think before you do that, maybe can you tell us about sort of the function of your token and why doing a sale at all was necessary?
Totally, yeah. So our goal is what we're doing is we're creating a full platform, full stack for decentralized applications. And we provide this to developers, and developers build these applications for the end users. And it's the system where the users, they get their identity on Blockstack, they have their own personal cloud, their own private cloud, and they have their own data storage on Blockstack, and then they can bring it with them between the different applications. So there's not just a relationship between the user and the application, but there's also a relationship that the user has with Blockstack itself, in the same way that the user is exposed to Bitcoin or Ethereum when they use an application. And two of the biggest parts of our platform today are the identity and authentication system and our storage system. And one component that we're really looking to provide at a deeper level is the transaction layer. So we want something that's actually a full application suite for developers all the way up and down. And being able to provide that on the blockchain level, having our own blockchain, being able to allow developers to use our decentralized domain name system, which runs on the blockchain today on Bitcoin, but able to use our own blockchain is very, very important. And in the future, we could add a few other things like smart contracts and so on, much deeper capabilities. But what we're really trying to do is have this one-stop shop for everything for our developers. And we saw the token as an important component, not just for the technological capabilities of being able to send transactions, but also from the community perspective, being able to create an economy that anyone, like essentially this digital economy that anyone in the system can participate in and essentially have a piece of. And we saw the token coming first. We actually were decided on doing a token before we decided to do a token sale. We were actually experimenting with a few different models. We had a really good conversation with Zooko. We're considering actually the Zcash model. We're considering the ICO model, the token sale model. We were considering a few different models, and we ultimately decided to do a sale. Ultimately decided to do accredited only with the voucher program for non-accredited investors. And we saw the token sale as a way to not just have a token that allows for transaction and capabilities on our chain, and not just be essentially a currency, a unit of value in our in this new economy that we're building, but also would be able to have allow us to have some funding for the project, right? And that's why we went in that direction. And I think it's very important to be able to get as many people as possible to participate to really jumpstart that community with a certain number of people. We have about a little less than 1,000 accredited investors who participated, and about 9,000 non-accredited investors who participated in our voucher program. So just shy of 10,000 people who were in that, and those people will be either in the Genesis block or in some future release going forward. So I think that's very important for us to be able to get that huge base for the community.
So on that note, though, accredited investors were not given preferential rates when purchasing, yeah. Correct? But were they able to buy a greater quantity of tokens than a given one of those 9,000? Sorry, might be able to.
Yeah. So the way we structured it was accredited investors could purchase a certain number of tokens. We actually capped all of our investors at $3 million because what we saw was with some of the projects, there were like 3 or 4 investors who were buying out like more than 50% of the entire token sale. So we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to make sure that this didn't turn into some kind of oligopoly or some kind of aristocracy system. So we capped it at a certain amount. And again, you also have that same problem for tokens that didn't do token sales that are publicly trading. You have a lot of the really early coins. Some of the coins like Litecoin and so on have like pretty lopsided distributions. A few people who have like very large percentages of the currency. So just because in some ways, actually, if you do a token sale, it depends on how you do it. You could have a better Gini coefficient than if you were to not do it. Depends on the situation.
Sorry, I think you just said a phrase that you need to explain.
Sorry, yeah. Gini coefficient, it's a measure of the distribution of wealth across a population. And so like, I think it's rated from 0 to 1. And so the larger the Gini coefficient, the more the inequality. Am I getting that right? Does anyone remember which way it goes?
I think so.
Actually, and the 0 is like the less the inequality. So yeah, so we wanted to make sure that we actually capped the amount that the accredited investors could participate. We did a similar thing for non-accredited investors. For the vouchers, we said this voucher could potentially be used to purchase tokens up to $3,000. And that's of course non-binding, so it's not it's nothing that's like a contract or whatever. But it was at the same exact price that the accredited investors participated in.
I think actually, Marvin, I'm going to let you off the hook for talking about your ICO because we need to wrap this up. I think Wendy is looking at me. So, yeah, absolutely.
So we have a lot of questions, and we have about 15 minutes to ask those questions. Okay.
Thank you so much. So thanks so much to all of you. So given this week has been about kind of like looking back and lessons and what can be learned. What do you guys see looking forward as best case and potential worst case in terms of cryptocurrency and the law?
So, to me...
Start with best case.
Yeah, to me, best case is that things continue on the way they've evolved, actually. I mean, there are people who have suggested that the US has taken too heavy of a hand with regulating these things, and I don't know if I agree. I actually think the SEC has been very deliberate and careful with their enforcement actions and setting out their policies. And I think the balance they've struck between, as Zooko said, protecting people who have asymmetric information from scams against doing too much regulation that doesn't fit the regulatory subject, the new technology, and stifling innovation. I think they've walked that line very carefully. So
everyone with a private key, I just want to say, has asymmetric information. And so we should not share our private keys, but we should.
So I'd go,
very good joke.
I'd go kind of one step further, which is, in my best case, it should be almost a commodity market to be able to call any law firm, and they'll be able to get you set up with exactly what the legal framework is. And this is why, I mean, the goal of Protocol Labs is to improve computing, right? To decentralize the web, essentially. And we hope that, you know, lots of projects are using IPFS and Filecoin to store their data while they're building decentralized applications. And not all of you will have a team of lawyers. And so this is why we do things like publish the SAFT project, kind of getting information out there, try to provide guidance when we launch our token, because until it's just super simple that you can just pick up any phone and call a lawyer and they can tell you, here's the documents you use, we still have to kind of work this out and educate the community to the extent we can.
I'll just talk about something I'm really excited about. We're talking about different legal aspects of cryptocurrencies, and I think one thing that is really cool that we might see a lot of going on is the idea of the self-destructing organization. So organizations that are there might be some that are doing token sales, there might be some that are not, that are working on launching the network, like we saw with Zcash. But over time, it'll be really interesting to see some of these platforms actually move from having one organization that's clearly the main one in the community to having more and more over time, and potentially even having organizations split off into multiple parts. I mean, you look at the state of Bitcoin today, there's many different organizations that are contributing, and many different individuals that are contributing to the protocol development, that are contributing to services on top of it. Like you look at Coinbase, you look at the Blockstream, you have so many different companies, hundreds and hundreds of them. You look at the state of Ethereum today, you have you have so many different companies. You have the Ethereum Foundation, of course, and Consensus, which are perhaps the two most notable and two largest ones. But it's interesting because you've seen a lot of proliferation across of Ethereum. And one of the things that we got we thought was really interesting was when we were looking at Zcash, and they had the foundation, which actually has an expiration date, right? You had a 4-year expiration.
For the funding, but not for the organization.
Reward, yeah.
I thought you had a self-destructing provision. Do you not have that anymore?
There was talk years and years ago of having the company sort of shut down and like turn itself off after it had achieved a certain level. And I think that was naive because software always needs improvement.
Yeah.
So you have told us about the best case scenario.
Yeah.
Wasn't that nice? Now answer
her
the rest of her question. What's the worst case scenario?
It's what's happening in China right now.
Yeah.
Can you explain?
And probably similarly in several other countries like Turkey.
What does that mean? What is happening in China?
Well, the government is kind of banning the use of this technology, but kind of not, and so therefore no one really knows what's legal and safe. That's the worst case.
Is like a lack of clarity sort of a worse case
than lack of clarity is pretty
clarity
bad.
We didn't really want?
I mean...
And also how bad is the downside?
Yeah.
Like if it turns out that what you did was illegal, then how bad would it be for you? That's an important question.
Hostility is worse than lack of clarity. And fortunately, we don't see a lot of hostility towards these technologies from the US government, but there's certainly regimes around the world that do feel threatened by the technology, I think. And another thing that people write about, and I don't know how much I am concerned about this, but is sort of a Trojan horse, is governments adopting these technologies but building them with backdoors in them and then encouraging or subtly forcing their citizens to use them. I mean, on a certain level, Bitcoin's transparent blockchain and the ability to see into every transaction that goes across your entire economy is the ultimate tool for a totalitarian. It's not all that unlike possibly the system that China's building right now with respect to your citizen credit score. Like how good of a citizen are you?
But it has information symmetry at
so
least.
The worst case is that we fail to prevent the ongoing Orwellian nightmare spreading across the globe.
Or
by which you mean people
somehow
eating vegetables.
Reinforce it by handing it more effective technology than ever before.
Right, yeah.
That's what I'm terrified of.
I mean, an Oracle database is always going to be more controllable by their
I'm
by
not
its
sure.
key holder.
I'm not sure. Like, yeah.
If anything, if they waste their time building a centralized blockchain, which is just all the inefficiencies of your old database and none of the benefits of decentralization, then maybe we've actually slowed down the march of totalitarian states.
Google and Facebook blockchain, is that a bad case scenario that we can
take another question here?
Yeah, this question may be more towards Peter. Hey, Peter, the concern that the SEC expressed with respect to they expressed it by virtue of saying that it was, it's not a security now, the Ethereum.
Yeah.
But does the end justifies the means? In other words, if they regard the ICO as violating the law, but it is no longer, doesn't that open a Pandora's box for every ICO to say, yes, we may not be decentralized now, but we will be like Ethereum?
This idea of transmutation, that something starts off as a security and maybe becomes something else, makes a lot of people uneasy, and it actually makes me uneasy as well. Sometimes I think that perspective is almost like religions. Like the younger ones, they still look like sci-fi maybe, because some of them might have even been started by science fiction authors. But if they've been around for 2,000 years, then, you know, it's pretty real at that point. Like, that shouldn't be a test. That doesn't make sense as a test.
The religion test.
The religion test. That's a bad test. I'm not advocating that test. I don't think these things transmute, is my answer to your question. I think that what is the security is not the asset itself in the sense of a token. It is the agreement between somebody who promised something and somebody who invested in the thing. And subject to that agreement, there may be things that come out. Like in the Howey case, there were dollars that were paid in the profits from the oranges. There were oranges that came out, but it was the investment contract between Howey and the people buying the land in Florida that was a security. And importantly, the oranges that were later moving through the US economy were not still securities when they'd been resold. And nor was the land in Florida when it left the hands of the original Howey investor to be sold to somebody who wasn't going to grow oranges on it or have Howey grow oranges on it, was going to build a house on it. So I don't think these things transmute at all. I think what the SEC is pointing to when they're saying that something like the initial fundraising of a token might be a security is an agreement, an investment contract, and the Howey test is a test for an investment contract.
So you're saying it's the fundraising, not the token?
Yes. Yes, unless the token transparently is supposed to be a claim on the promoter's revenues. Then yes, of course the token's a security, nakedly. It's like a stock certificate. But if it's not a claim on the investors, on the promoter's revenues, and if it isn't just a fundraising tool, if it does something and is decentralized, then it's separate.
Final question.
There's another component of cryptocurrencies and the law that we haven't talked about at all today, which is like KYC and AML regulation. KYC AML stands for Know Your Customer and Anti-Money Laundering legislation. So at this point, one of the biggest bottlenecks for the cryptocurrency space as a whole is fiat on and off ramps. How do you get fiat currency into the system and how do you take it out? And we're starting to see more and more exchanges. I think Coinbase is a prime example, working with regulators, implementing KYC, AML policies, all that kind of stuff. As we look forward towards a world where I mean, maybe you still have to use banks to get fiat into this system, but where now you can move currency around the world unrestricted, and as we look forward to a world where more and more merchants start accepting cryptocurrencies as end payments, how do you see that changing the landscape of KYC AML regulation, both on kind of like the state level and for the individual?
So for the time being, and I think for the near future, the only institutions or persons who are responsible for know your customer or anti-money laundering compliance are sort of centralized institutions that handle other people's valuables. And those are banks, money services businesses, things like that, Coinbase included. And that's why they are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act and those compliance obligations. Now, a question might be, if that institution is dealing with a cryptocurrency that is inherently more private, can they still meet their obligations as an exchange or as a financial institution with respect to their compliance? And I wanted to hand this to Zooko, who has a fair amount of experience.
But that wasn't the question.
Well, I changed it slightly. Sorry, I changed your question slightly. But I think it's relevant to your question.
The answer to the original question is, I mean, Peter's answer to the original question is, he doesn't see it changing anytime soon. The law says that banks and payment processors or whoever have these responsibilities to do this stuff. But if you receive Bitcoin and then you use the Bitcoin to buy a thing from someone, none of those laws apply to you because you're not a bank. Yeah, and I agree with Peter. I don't see anyone trying to require average consumers to do anything different anytime soon.
Or miners or software developers for that matter.
It would be really bad if you had to take a selfie of your friend when they gave you money, right?
It would probably be unconstitutional too, because the reason why the government can deputize banks to do that kind of financial surveillance is because the bank is a third party, the third party doctrine that Jennifer Granick was talking about this morning. We don't generally deputize citizens to spy on other citizens. We generally deputize institutions who are third parties to transactions to collect information because people willingly handed their information off to the third party and lost their expectation of privacy.
So Zooko, I think also relevant to this question, because Zcash is a coin that's particularly concerned with privacy, which is where you often run into these conflicts with know your customer and anti-money laundering laws. But you scored a pretty significant victory recently that I don't know that a lot of people talked about, and I would love to hear that.
So that was Peter's question, is does having privacy in the blockchain technology conflict with the KYC AML rules, the Know Your Customer Anti-Money Laundering rules? And everyone kind of naively assumes that it does, or they naively assume that like governments will hate Zcash and will stamp it out even if it doesn't. But as it turns out, the US government, in the form of this one regulator called the New York Department of Financial Services, which is a really important regulator, even though it has New York in its name. That regulator has recently given permission for the financial institutions that serve New York customers to use the encryption, Zcash with its encryption features. And that shows that in their opinion, Zcash's encryption is compatible with the Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering regulations, which is the right answer if you think about it, because the Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering regulations say when someone opens an account with you, you're required to ask for like photo ID, and if one of your customers is doing something weird and suspicious, you're required to report that person to the cops. And that's perfectly compatible with using blockchains, and it's also perfectly compatible with using Zcash.
Let me see if I have this straight, because there are many knowledgeable people out there who know KYC laws and all this other stuff, but I'm new to this, so let me see if I can summarize this as a lay person. It'd be so nice if you could just go and ask a lawyer, hey, is this legal? And everyone would say, yeah, that's legal or that's illegal. You're not going to get that if you're going to do this. They're going to get all sorts of opinions.
Well,
and you're probably going
about securities law, but not about KYC.
Okay, about securities law. And then you don't want it to be a security, because then you'd have to comply with lots and lots of regulations. Good regulations to protect people. And And so you kind of contort yourself to offer it to only high value people. There's certain things that make it okay if you have a certain kind of bank account or how much you can afford. So you offer it to a little group of people under circumstances, but your whole goal is to empower a community of open source developers to work with you. So that doesn't feel very good. So some of you have offered a voucher, so anyone can comply. Some of you thought, oh, I'm not even going to go down that route. I'm just going to have these rules, okay, the founders get 20%, blah, 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 I'm going to just set this up. And you would think that's a really good thing because you're so successful. But then, hey, that's a good thing in most companies. 20% of a successful thing is a good thing, except you're so worried about this because this whole open source community that has to work with you is saying, wow, you sure don't seem like you deserve 20% of our work. And so you're contorting yourself and thinking, wow, maybe Vitalik was right. If I could just figure out a way so that if it gets really successful, I'm going to earn a lot less. That would be a really good thing. But we couldn't quite figure that out.
Fortunately, it's got a timeout built into it, so.
Yeah, and I want to do a privacy coin where it's end-to-end encrypted so no one will know how it's being used, but then I'm really in legal territory that's even more uncharted, but I won a victory, so that's looking better. So we all think it's so easy to put out an ICO or do something, launch a new coin, get lots, 300 million, 4 billion someone raised. But you're really telling me it's actually kind of a lot of minefields, and you're just jumping over them, hoping you don't land in one of those minefields. Because at the end of the day, you guys aren't doing this to get rich necessarily. You're doing this to fuel a community of developers to build something that helps a lot of people. So money is necessary. You want money, you need money, but if you make too much money, you're going to be in big trouble with your community.
It's a means to an end, and whether it has a positive or negative effect on that end depends on how much it is and how it's managed.
And it's allocated well to fund developers and application development, services that are supporting the network. Et cetera. I think that's an important thing because it depends on exactly how that funding is distributed.
So if I learned anything today, and I want to thank you because I learned a lot, it's that it's not as easy as I thought it was to raise so much money to fuel this movement.
Well, I'm afraid it's quite easy to raise a lot of money in an ICO. You're looking at 3 people who have been involved in new token or new cryptocurrency projects who have, I think, some of the best consciences, some of the best ethics that I've encountered, and that's why they agonize over it, and they're willing to go through the conversations with the lawyers. There's certainly other projects out there that have just taken the easy money.
Well, thank you all of you for opening up your books, bearing your souls, sharing your woes. I think a lot of people know a lot more, and I'm sure they have a lot more questions. So let's give it up for the Cryptocurrency and the Law panel, our final panel of the day. Thank you very much. You know what? In just 10 more minutes, we're going to have our final session. It's Cory Doctorow, so you won't want to miss it. 10 minutes in the courtyard. Thank you.